what's shaping up to be nuclear energy policy in this Trump administration, there's really a strong through line. Everybody wants energy security. I think Japan has also experienced energy insecurity since shutting down its reactors in the aftermath of Fukushima. I think when we think about next generation reactors, whether that is SMRs, which can provide on and off grid power, we need all of the above for the future of decarbonization.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to go across the Atlantic today over to Washington to interview one of our elite people in the nuclear industry. But before we introduce our great guest, you might not always see him in front of the camera, but behind the camera, our Director of Government Relations, Max Austin, joins us today because our guest speaker is Jennifer Gordon from the Atlantic Council, one of the world's leading nuclear experts. Jennifer, welcome to the Wolfe Power Club.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
And Max, are you happy to be here?
Well, I'm particularly pleased to see Jennifer. I mean, we go back to the dark days of COVID in the build-up to COP26, something we can talk a bit about later, but it's been fantastic to get you on the podcast, Jennifer, and particularly to talk about nuclear energy, not just in the US, but around the world at a difficult time.
So, very positive time, though, as well. And we're going to get straight into it, Jennifer. One of the big issues over in the UK has been almost this euphoria about the potential of small nuclear reactors. Perhaps for the rest of the podcast, we'll call it SMRs. Not all of our listeners will know what they are. But the obvious questions that sort of comes across to all of us in the world of energy is, well, do they actually help meet climate change? Because that's what they've been billed as this great saviour and the goals. Are they actually economically viable? Because although I love nuclear power, and for those who are listening in, we are completely biased on the podcast. I spent most of my childhood at nuclear power stations as my father was head of spent fuels at British Energy. But is it economically viable? And then the final bit is deployment, because there's one thing of a great idea, there's one thing that's a business case that works on paper, but will deployment happen? So what's the reality of SMRs, Jennifer?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me take a quick step back and just speak, first of all, about nuclear more broadly. So I think we tend to think of nuclear reactors as, first of all, the existing fleet, which are the large, generally light water reactors. Large light water reactors are the backbone of a decarbonized grid in pretty much any country that has already deployed them and has them as part of their power sector. And so I think when we think about next generation reactors, whether that is SMRs, which can provide on and off grid power, also advanced, micro reactors that can be mobile, can be stationary, also can provide power off grid for heavy industrial uses. I think we need all of the above for the future of decarbonization. Again, whether that's power sector decarbonization on the one hand, or off-grid decarbonization, hard to decarbonize, hard to abate industries. So yes, absolutely, SMRs, microreactors are part of that suite of nuclear technologies. In terms of economic viability, I think one issue, and it's very difficult to really assess the cost of nuclear because, you're also getting into, things like the cost of transmission or the cost of, the full life cycle. But I think when you get into it, the imperative to decarbonize, the imperative to have energy security, which nuclear also brings, and these are things that I think help with as you're thinking through the cost. Again, tough to think through the actual cost of next generation reactors because most countries have not yet deployed them, and so a lot of it we're going to have to wait and see how those dollars actually add up.
Can I ask a question, Jennifer, about what the situation is in the US? Obviously, a change of government, a change of administration, but still a continued commitment to nuclear. What's your assessment of the US Department of Energy's approach to deploying SMRs in America?
I think one thing to remember, it's not just the Department of Energy, it is also Congress, it's our legislation, it's the role of the private sector, it's, kind of everybody having to work together, hopefully be on the same sheet of music. And I think because, Max, you mentioned the change in administration, we often say in DC that nuclear energy policy is the only thing that Republicans and Democrats agree on. I think this is actually true because if you look at nuclear energy policy in the first Trump administration, nuclear energy policy in the Biden administration, and I think what is shaping up, and of course it's early, but what's shaping up to be nuclear energy policy in this Trump administration, there's really a strong through line. Everybody wants energy security. Everybody wants public-private partnerships. Everyone, I think, right now wants to pass bipartisan legislation. And so, there's a lot of continuity. There's a lot of continuity even in the people. We're seeing a lot of familiar faces right now coming back from the first Trump administration who supported really, really great policies on nuclear energy, 4 years ago. We're seeing a lot of them come back now. So I think there's a lot of optimism with one caveat that I'll share with you, which is that I think that there are policies right now being put into place that touch nuclear energy, but that are not directly nuclear energy policies. So like tariffs, for example, policies that possibly cut funding, to educational institutions, things like that I think are going to make it difficult to, number one, build reactors here in the United States, sell reactors overseas, and then two, that could have implications, serious implications for supply chain and then also for workforce. So I think, we're keeping an eye closely on nuclear energy policy in this administration, but also on what I think we're all calling these adjacent policy areas that I think we haven't had to follow quite as closely until now.
What we do know, though, is like whether it's on the politics side of either party in the US or individual states, America, like myself, loves business. And my excitement over SMRs is that it feels like we could, for the first time, have a bit of a global market. And I was just wondering your thoughts about this idea of this potential export of them around the world and potentially how manufacturers could power transitioning or developing economies, which, say, wasn't a possibility when you had major nation infrastructure projects that were nuclear, that were very country specific, whereas this looks like it could be a global market. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one issue to consider is that I think the large light water reactors, which we all love, love the current fleet, love where it's operating. But one issue with it is that it's not, large reactors are not necessarily appropriate to every country's grid. And so you have, especially in a lot of developing countries where a large light water reactor, if you built it, it would just completely overwhelm the grid. And so you need to look at reactors that are more in that 300 megawatt class, so SMRs, or even, again, micro reactors that have off-grid applications. And so I think you see a lot of countries, again, especially in the global south, that are interested in next generation reactors. You see countries that I think that want both. For example, I was just in Poland last week. Poland obviously wants the large light water reactors. They also want the SMRs. And there are applications, I think, globally, especially in industrialized economies for process heat. So I think, we're seeing not just newcomer countries. We're also seeing new types of demand. We're seeing in the United States and abroad, and I'm sure this is maybe scooping your next question, but we're seeing new types of customers that we haven't seen before, because the traditional customers for nuclear power have, of course, been the utilities. And now we're seeing the tech companies that wanted to power their data centers, wanted to power AI operations. We're seeing industrial customers as well, like steel companies, mining companies, oil and gas companies that want advanced reactors and micro reactors to power their operations, in the Permian Basin, for example. So we're just seeing this enormous and incredibly diverse array of countries and also industries and sectors that have really never thought about nuclear, and they're thinking about it now.
So that does bring me on to nicely. obviously great listener, great friend of the podcast, the IEA's Fatih. When he came to London and it was speaking in February at International Energy Week, he basically said in his keynote speech, this is the year of nuclear. He said, in the last 12 months, there's never ever been more power both used and produced by nuclear across the world, and they are seeing a sort of big uptake. You've obviously touched on a few areas, but looking back at that last 12 months, was it things like data centers that triggered that real positive reaction to using nuclear? Because I know nuclear sometimes has great years, challenging years, but it sounds like a real positive place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think something that we're seeing, and also, so 2 weeks ago I was in Japan, and so it's difficult to talk about the nuclear story and the Japan story without talking about nuclear reactors that have restarted. We're seeing some of that as well here in the United States. So restarts with 3 Mile Island, with the Palisades. And so I think that's something that's really, really exciting, that you have these reactors that are perfectly good, and they've just been kind of sitting and waiting for their moment. I think their moment has come, and it's great to see reactors restart. Also great to see in the United States, we've extended the lifetimes of a number of our reactors in our current fleet. So we're really, I think, trying to make the most out of the assets that exist, while also walking and chewing gum at the same time, looking at next generation, at Gen 3 and Gen 4 reactors as well.
Just sort of building on your visit to Japan, where I know when we had our pre-COP26 discussion, Jennifer, discussing in parts of how do you win over the public on the nuclear question. And in Japan, for obvious reasons, in 2011, there's been maybe public hesitancy, skepticism of nuclear as part of the energy mix. And in 2023, Ipsos did a poll of 24 countries that found that only 38% of adults supported nuclear. And that seems to me to be at odds with the 72% that also support the swift phase out of fossil fuels and the energy transition. So how do we win over different populations to accept that nuclear is safe, that it's reliable, and that it's increasingly essential if you want to move to a low carbon energy mix?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. So, one thing is, I do think there is potentially a generational divide in public opinion on nuclear. So I've heard, and haven't seen the statistic myself, but I've heard that even in Germany, there's a generational divide, and the younger generation is interested in nuclear and has actually seen the results of decommissioning perfectly good nuclear reactors, and is unhappy with those results. So I think, and that's in one country, which maybe, Germany may be kind of an extreme example, but I think, one other thing that I think is a factor is when you have, and again, I believe there are statistics on this as well, that when you have communities that live closer to a nuclear power plant, they actually tend to be more in favor of nuclear energy than communities that live far away from a nuclear power plant and don't really know what it is, but they've, heard scary stories or they watched a Netflix special. And so that's their only experience with it, where, Alex, I'm going to pick on you, but you have somebody who's actually grown up around nuclear, and they tend to turn out to be pretty pro-nuclear, surprise, surprise. And so, for example, in a country like Romania, that's been operating Canadian reactors for decades, I think the approval rating for nuclear energy, the public opinion, is something like 87%, which is like off the charts. And so the more nuclear you have, the more you tend to support it.
Can I just ask, just a follow up, looking back to those days before COP26, where we were all locked up, and you and I were part of a group that were trying to make the case for nuclear to be part of the broader discussion on tackling climate change and reducing emissions. And I remember you, Randolph Bell, were sort of pulling your hair out because there nearly wasn't going to be a discussion on nuclear at COP26. I think it only came about September, October. It was really late in the day. And I think in maybe a European context, what has changed since COP26 in Glasgow is the war in Ukraine. And as energy policy has now become a national security issue, nuclear has undergone somewhat of a renaissance. I was thinking about Finland in particular, very strong anti-nuclear tradition, particularly in their Green Party, who are now advocating for investment into nuclear technologies because they see it as a matter of national security, national defense. And I suppose my question to you is reflecting on really how in the last 3 years, nuclear, as it's been merged with other policy areas like defense, like national security, has really undergone something of a renaissance to the extent that, last week we had in the UK, which London Council was at, a summit on the future of energy security. Be interested in your thoughts on that.
Max, thanks so much. I think, well, two things. One, it always kind of is painful for me when I hear people outside of the nuclear energy industry, but in the energy sector, talking about how you can't have energy security and decarbonization at the same time. And, that's when I sort of start jumping up and down and raising my hand and saying, yes, you can, because you can have nuclear and then you can have both and you don't have to choose. I think your point about COP26 is a really good one. And so, in my own personal experience, and I think you were with us at the castle,
Yeah,
so, and if you remember, the castle in
better
Scotland,
than Glasgow.
right?
Yeah.
But I mean, just geographically, it was so the castle was where the Atlantic Council ran our programming during COP26. And I wish that all of you listeners could have joined us. But we did, at least a day of programming fully devoted to nuclear energy policy. But the castle was about a 45-minute drive outside of Glasgow, and you drive through these like beautiful fields, but you're really, really in the middle of nowhere. And then only 2 years later, we were all in Dubai at COP28. And of course, nuclear energy at COP28 was front and center. And it was in the green zone, it was in the blue zone, it was, it was off campus, so to speak, but it was everywhere, all at once. And the difference for me was just so tremendous. And you really saw, and I think, again, I think you're right, absolutely, that Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine really, I think, made people realize that, oh, we also need energy security and nuclear is one way to get it. But, I think in those 2 years, that difference was just so tremendous. And I think that the importance, too, of nuclear being accepted front and center at the world's premier climate conference, went so far beyond rhetoric. And I think it actually had real life tangible implications for things like nuclear energy then being included in Canada's green bond system, and so making it okay to like nuclear both from an energy security perspective but then also from a climate decarbonization perspective as well.
It leads nicely to the thing, and I think that whole thing of international relations acceptance, that whole thing about where you start, and I actually think you're right. I mean, I know we joke about my childhood nuclear centres. For our listeners who don't know, my dad was a nuclear engineer for 40 years, and we spent most of my childhood, and he had a lovely childhood in the summer in Vienna as he worked with one of the very big organisations over there. But I think that one thing I really would ask anyone that's on here that's an educator is that we need to get more of this into schools and universities. So like, I know certainly that I was lucky, I had a father in the nuclear industry. So when we did like an energy project, I remember I remember it so clearly from primary school, even though it was a long time ago, where like the teacher was like, oh, these terrible towers, and she was actually showing cooling towers. So I said, no, that's wrong. Like, I've been to every visit, that's steam, that there's nothing wrong with that. So my dad came in, did a talk, and by the end of that talk, there was like, 200 children who like nuclear's great, went home and told their parents. And then at university, when I did a project with People and Planet when I was involved in the Students' Union, we managed to get one of the big energy companies, it was a nuclear company, to sponsor the fair, and it just gave a whole different slant, because the committee meeting that started before the fair was that someone said something incorrect about nuclear. This is terrible, and until I raised it and we got a sponsor, suddenly it changed the narrative. So I just wondered a bit, Gemma, before we go into some of the UK specific issues, what does the Atlantic Council want to achieve in terms of, because obviously you are a not-for-profit, but you guys have a huge voice in energy, and just a little bit more about your day job. It would be great to tell our listeners and what the Atlantic Council is trying to do on nuclear momentum.
Sure. Well, so first of all, let me say, I think we're all jealous of your childhood. Summers in Vienna sound incredible. Um, I would say, and I'll talk in a minute about the Atlantic Council's work, but just a caveat that we are, much, much more at the policy level. We're not the ones going into schools, although I would certainly happily go into my own children's school and talk about nuclear energy policy. Um, haven't been invited yet. But the American Nuclear Society does an incredible K through 12 program, so kindergarten through senior year of high school, where they do try to teach nuclear energy, at grade appropriate levels. They're not teaching like engineering, nuclear engineering to kindergartners. But I think programs like that are really, really important. From an Atlantic Council perspective, where we spend most of our time, and kind of my own day to day, is speaking with people again at that policy level. So decision makers in the US federal government. We do a lot of state-based work in the United States as well, because even though we are a foreign affairs think tank and, we really come at nuclear energy from a national security perspective, from a global exports perspective, we also believe that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to export something and a technology that you're not first licensing and deploying at home. And so we're trying to build that through line from the domestic work that's going on right now in the United States to our international work. So we do a lot of talking with state state policymakers, state legislatures, universities, which have just an incredible reach in their states. So, just for example, University of Tennessee and that system, the University of Utah system, that are really, really doing phenomenal work to bring their own state stakeholders together, and then we try to engage and help where we can.
Fantastic. So, as I say, I think you can tell that the podcast is kind of fanboys of nuclear, but we also, like many of our listeners ask, we don't stray away from the difficult topics and the difficult issues. Now, the following is a very UK specific issue, so I just put that out there, but it's probably a classic example of when in a country there was a big nuclear movement, say 40, 50 years ago, built massive infrastructure, and then whether it's through politics, economics, a mixture of the two, there's then been a struggle of investment. But our Sellafield nuclear power site back in 2023 was put under special measures because essentially there was an audit done, and it was from a mixture of both physical and cybersecurity safety concern that basically it wasn't safe enough. This February, thankfully, it came out of special measures and there was a commitment to that. But I was just wondering, sort of on a physical or cybersecurity base, because, we cover energy security quite a bit on this podcast, what does nuclear need to do? Because obviously you've got a mixture of ages. I can imagine the newer stuff is much easier to plan for because it's been built in the era when this type of stuff happens. But some of the equipment that's out there is obviously from a different generation, and from a cost or cyber side has probably got to be developed. I was just wondering, on the actual security side, whether it's physical or whether it's cyber, what should the nuclear industry be doing?
From a very sort of broad perspective, I think some of the things that are the most important in terms of ensuring security for the nuclear energy industry are ensuring that we have a culture and that we're fostering a culture of transparency, that we have whistleblower protections, and that there's accountability, and and again, making sure that people know if they raise an alarm somewhere, there's not going to be retaliation. And so I think having those measures in place, obviously you want good governance, in a country, and I think that will ensure, and also obviously the role of the regulator. And it's been, I would say, a little bit disturbing to hear over the last, I don't know, a few months, or I guess maybe the voices are always there, but they seem to be growing louder. People speaking against national regulatory authorities in whichever country we're talking about, because I think that having a strong independent regulatory body again is that to me that's the baseline, and the bedrock of ensuring that you have safety and security in your nuclear programs.
I think you're right with nuclear. As you say, the community's very good at working together, great engineering minds, finding ways to actually, get the maximum life out of assets, develop assets, and make them safe with good regulators. One of the other difficult challenges with nuclear is funding. And I'm going to use the UK example because I know it well. So back in my downstream oil days, I opened a fuel depot in Anglesey, which for our international listeners don't know is the north of Wales, and it's the main port and coastline between mainland UK and the Republic of Ireland. So it's basically where the big transport ferries go across. Perfect for nuclear. You got wonderful sea there for cooling attributes and so on. And it was going to be Britain's probably largest ever nuclear project in terms of output of power, in that it was going to supply 6% of UK power. And then in 2020, and it had been going on for many years, they formed colleges where people were studying nuclear professions and so on. Then suddenly, a mixture of COVID, a mixture of the economic environments, a mixture of financing, Hitachi pulled their investment and planned investment, and what was going to be a £16 billion project and was going to employ thousands of people didn't happen. And it really was a hit for the nuclear industry in Britain. So although we've talked about many positives today, that is some of the backdrop in the last decade they're dealing with. And I was just wondering, therefore, like financially, how do we get a place that more nuclear stuff doesn't just stay as a beautiful CAD drawing with a sort of excitement when it's launched? It actually ends up as an operating part of the power grid and delivers for nations. Because if a first world country, G7 nation like UK, is struggling, I can only imagine what the effects are in other parts of the world. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are to avoid another Anglesey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I'm not going to lie to you. Nuclear is expensive. We all know that. The upfront capital costs, hugely expensive. I mean, obviously, the idea is once it's built, it pays itself back. It pays for itself. But I think getting over that hurdle is the challenge. It's especially difficult, and this gets both in terms of building, but also in terms of export financing. Difficult when you have a country like in the United States where the industry is fully private. And then you look again kind of on the global, in the global market, we're competing, and again, this is in exports, but competing with countries like Russia and China that of course have state-owned nuclear enterprises. And so that becomes, a very, very difficult competition, and it's not a level playing field. I think whether we're talking about the UK example that you just gave, and kind of how do we build domestically, or talking about how do we export and compete against state-owned enterprises, in Russia and China, I think a lot of it is going to be public-private partnerships. A lot of it could be co-financing nuclear builds with our partners and allies from around the world. And I think we have to really think through all of the different tools in the toolbox, and tools that we may not be using. So, in the United States, in our context, looking at, for example, the U.S. Export-Import Bank, which has played a strong role over the last several years, but had only been reauthorized in, I think, 2019 or early 2020. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation also only lifted its nuclear project finance ban back in, I think, 2020. So it's only been relatively recently in the United States that we've had, even the whole suite of tools available to us actually be available. I think looking at the World Bank, and looking at them kind of as a next step for lifting, trying to urge the World Bank to reconsider its own ban on nuclear project finance, I think would be a good next step. But again, I think we have to bring all of our assets to bear, because it is a tough hurdle to get over at first.
From one nuclear stereotype to the other, one is money, the other is safety. And I was just reflecting, Jennifer, talking about perceptions, childhood perceptions of nuclear. Mine was certainly shaped by The Simpsons, and seeing Homer Simpson go, as I think were most of my generation, and particularly you don't come from an energy world where, I don't know how many times Springfield suffered as a consequence of nuclear meltdown. But there is some sort of, it's a flippant comment, but there is some truth in that. And I'm just conscious that you've just been, I don't know whether it's deliberate or serendipity, to Fukushima and to Warsaw. Obviously, Fukushima famously, 2011, as I said earlier, had its own nuclear problems, and Warsaw suffered the fallout in 1986 from Chernobyl. I'm just really interested in what you think your view is of the Polish and Japanese public's perception of nuclear and what their involvement is as states in the nuclear, in nuclear as part of their energy mix. 40 years on in Poland's case, 15 years on in Japan's.
It seems that there is a tremendous desire in Poland for nuclear energy. And again, that's kind of an all of the above approach to nuclear energy, both in terms of the agreement with Westinghouse for the large light water reactors, and then also the GE BWX 300 project that's going on as well. And so there seems again to be this tremendous drive in Poland for nuclear that may well be shaped, especially right now by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Although I think that drive actually started, longer ago than just 2022. I think in Japan, opinion again is changing. I think that my understanding is that the restarts of the reactors is something that's being welcomed. I think Japan has also experienced energy insecurity since shutting down its reactors in the aftermath of Fukushima. And I have to say as well, just on a very personal note, seeing Fukushima for the first time was, first of all, just incredibly moving. Realizing the scale of the site is something that, even though I work in this field, I just had not been able to comprehend until I saw it with my own eyes. And then understanding, just the extent to which good decisions were made, and then now how much remediation and how much the site has gone through, while at the same time, Japan has been working to restart its other reactors. So just knowing that that's only been 14 years, it's really just phenomenally impressive. So I recommend as well to you, if in case you haven't had a chance, and then to all of your listeners, if anyone has the opportunity to go and see Fukushima themselves, do it. It's a once in a lifetime experience.
I think that's a great recommendation. And before the trouble started in Ukraine, I did actually go and see Chernobyl. And actually what I saw was work starting around the power industry again. Obviously, for our listeners, what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, we fully support the Ukrainian side. But it also showed actually how after something so terrible, it regenerates. People still want to engage in it. People still, and it was fascinating. You could, we sort of did our tour around, and we had dinner at the site. And what was also fascinating was you got a Geiger meter, and you got to go. And interestingly, when you went around the blast zone, it wasn't actually that bit that was the most radioactive. Now it's almost like 8-9 miles away, where river streams had gone to natural basins, and there was a children's nursery that was very close. Obviously, it hasn't been a children's nursery for 40 years, but I found it fascinating. It was a real education, as you say, at these events. You both see how this stuff works, and I think my father also said that to me about Fukushima, was that actually, as you said, a lot of good decision making happened in a challenging environment to actually bring it, and now you've gone full circle and you're seeing the rebuild and going into that. I'm going to go into the quick fire questions, only short answers that we're looking for. So if you were investing time or money in the energy industry right now, where would you invest it?
I think I would invest on the buyer side right now, or I would create a magical fund that invested a little bit in each of the company of the reactor developers. But I think what's really interesting right now is to see the buyer side. And so again, what that means is, the Amazon, Google, Facebook, Meta, those kinds of companies that want nuclear energy to power their operations, but also oil and gas companies, also Nucor Steel, companies that are really, really forward leaning and thinking very seriously, very thoughtfully about where they're going to get their energy to power all of their operations.
If you're an entrepreneur right now in 2025, do you think you can become a sort of billionaire, millionaire from the nuclear industry in 2025?
I don't think that there's any get rich quick scheme out there. Um,
I like that. Buy your nuclear gigawatts now. Trade it fast. It could be the next crypto. That'd be great.
but in all seriousness, I think nuclear is something that we're looking at reactors with lifespans of 100 years. And so if you're in nuclear, you're playing the long game and you're not a day trader.
I'm going to pass Max the next quick fire.
What do you want from the governments of the United States, the UK, and the EU over the next 12 months?
First of all, I want to see far more cooperation and recognizing that there is a lot that we agree on, but we have to do it together. I want to see regulatory certainty. I want, and ideally, steps towards regulatory harmonization, so that a company can go through the process and have it be streamlined in a number of different countries at once. And I think financial support, again, for governments and governments that don't have state-owned enterprises, but to still recognize that nuclear energy, number one, has a national, has a value for national security, has a value for decarbonization. And so I think placing those values on nuclear energy and really seeing it, as a national security asset, in the same way that, we see a lot of other things. But truly valuing nuclear, I think, is what we need to see in the next year or so.
Fantastic, Emma. And I know our time is almost coming to an end. We can't wait till you're next in London. I did say to London, we probably can't make the Atlantic Council Big Summit this year, but we aim to be there in 2026 as a podcast and live broadcast from Washington. That is Max and I's aim for the next 12 months ahead. But and certainly when you're next in London, we'll show you everything from Wimbledon Village through to Westminster, so you can have a great time. But the final thing is that we always feel that everyone has a go at governments, everyone has a go at the companies, but we sometimes feel that there needs to be a bit of inspiration on the customer side. What would you ask energy customers to do in the next 12 months?
So I think that the more that you know about where your energy is coming from, and that's, if you're a private energy consumer and you want to know, what happens when you turn the lights on in your house, or you just bought a nice new EV, okay, is it being powered by, when you charge it, is that coming from a coal-fired plant? Is that coming from a nuclear plant? Like, what's the deal? So being aware, and then again, if you're an energy customer like one of these major companies, also being aware, of the energy sources that you're using. And so I just think more knowledge, and actually, if you'll permit me just one quick story, I remember talking to someone who had been a former commissioner at the NRC, and he said he was teaching a class, and he asked the class, where does your energy come from? And somebody said, from the wall. And so, I think we need to maybe go a step or two beyond from the wall.
I love it, Jennifer. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we've had one of the leading brains of the nuclear world. Not only has Jennifer been in Warsaw recently in Fukushima, but today is called in from Washington to tell us about the hope that is there for the nuclear industry. It is clear for the Wolfe Power Club that if you want to do the double, and that is energy transition and energy security, nuclear is such an obvious answer for every nation to be investing in right now, and it can be done at multiple levels, from the big projects through to the small nuclear reactors. Jennifer, I really thank you for your time today. It's been an absolute indulgence to build on my childhood visits at Sizewell and CERN to actually hear what's happening now rather than just my fond childhood memories. Jennifer, thank you very much for being a guest on the Wolfe Power Club.
Thank you both so much. This was wonderful.